So I want to talk about sort of the federal role in all this, and to build on something Karen talked about, which is how do we get the policies and incentives right at the federal level that create the incentives to allow for innovation, to do it in a way that creates economic incentives for our farmers, for the supply chain, and everybody to address climate change. We are used to polarization around climate change. You watch what's happening in Washington, D.C. these days, and sometimes it makes your head hurt. And we're used to conflict around environmental issues and climate change in particular. I spent a good chunk of my early career working on endangered species issues on private lands in the wake of the spotted owl debates in the Pacific Northwest. People can find a lot of ways to fight about endangered species, given the high costs, the challenges that many of those species face. And likewise, on climate change, a lot of folks in agriculture worry that climate policy is going to be done to them and not with them. That it's going to be something that feels like it's delivered from Washington, D.C., from on high, that can't be integrated into agricultural operations, and then it creates real costs for farmers and ranchers. But one of the things that's most interesting to me about climate and climate-smart agriculture and forestry is that there is alignment between what can be good for agriculture and forestry and what can be good for climate in a way that you don't see on a lot of other issues. I mentioned endangered species, and one of the challenges with endangered species is endangered species often live on some pretty costly land. And that creates economic challenges for producers and challenges for how we think about public policy. When we think about climate, the opportunity to improve soil health, we can sequester more carbon and we can increase the productivity of lands. In the case of livestock, we can take methane, a waste product, and we can turn it into a source of energy. And perhaps with things like feed additives, we can capture more of the protein and carbon that's in the feed and improve the productivity of our cattle. California, I don't need to talk to you all about wildfires, but there are opportunities to address wildfires in a way that create jobs for our timber communities, for our rural communities, by thinning forests, by improving the health of our forests, reducing the threat of catastrophic wildfire, and create economic opportunities. So there's alignment in climate that you don't see on a lot of other environmental issues. And the question from a policy perspective is, how do we take advantage of that? And how do we design what we do to spur private investment and to spur activities of those hundreds of thousands of farmers and ranchers and forest owners across the country, to encourage them to take on climate-smart agriculture and forestry? So there's alignment, but there's also skepticism. And part of the skepticism is a recognition that there are risks. Anytime you ask somebody to take on a new practice, there are risks associated with that. There are costs. New practices have costs that go along. Karen talked about some of the costs associated with methane digesters or other practices that go along with it. And there's also skepticism still in the countryside about what climate policy looks like. There's skepticism in the environmental community. There had been for years about any role that agriculture could play in reducing emissions and sequestering carbon in soils. The same thing on the forestry side. There's skepticism in corners of the environmental community about animal agriculture having any role at all in climate policy and climate incentives. And of course, still concerns about what markets and offsets and other things mean for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And behind all of that is a need for all of us to think about how do we answer those critics with science, with data, with better economics, that we can demonstrate we can do right by agriculture and we can do right by the planet at the same time. The approach that you have seen and will continue to see from the Biden administration around climate-smart agriculture and forestry is one that relies on incentives, voluntary approaches. It's about collaboration. It's not about environmental policy done to you. It's about environmental policy done with folks in agriculture and forestry. It's about creating markets. Ultimately, it's about creating value. It's about creating values for producers to reward them for stewardship, and folks in the supply chain to reward them for the innovative solutions that they come up with that allow us to reduce greenhouse gas emissions even while we enhance productivity. And productivity gets lost in this conversation a lot. And if you look at the debate in Europe, for example, around climate-smart agriculture and forestry, you see that part of the approach that the Europeans have taken is to put downward pressure on productivity. That is, in some respects, to reduce productivity in agriculture. That's not a great climate strategy, right? Because all you do is shift emissions to satisfy the demand for agricultural commodities elsewhere. And so not only do we have to think about the strategies to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and to increase sequestration, we actually have to do it while we increase productivity, while we increase profitability for producers. And for folks in U.S. agriculture, we are good at productivity and we are good at efficiency. And if we create a value for reducing greenhouse gas emissions, U.S. agriculture is going to be very, very good at this. But the question is, how do we align U.S. policy through the Department of Agriculture and elsewhere in a way that spurs innovation and that people are willing to take on the risks of adopting new practices or take on the risks of changing their operations in ways that can address climate change. The good news is, and again, Karen made reference to this, is we're at a time when we actually have significant resources. In the USDA, we have significant resources, thanks in no small part to the Inflation Reduction Act, $19.5 billion in new dollars for climate-smart agriculture and forestry practices. Now, as you all know, climate-smart agriculture and practices aren't new. We've been doing a lot of this stuff for a long time. We just ain't called it climate-smart agriculture and forestry. But whether it was soil health or improved grazing land management, whether it was improved forest management, we've been doing this stuff for a while. And we have an opportunity to expand on those efforts and to demonstrate the stewardship that so many of our farmers, ranchers, and forest owners have adopted for a long time. $19.5 billion is a lot of money. But in truth, we need to spend these dollars in a way that, again, invites additional resources, additional interest from the private sector. You all also know that while NRCS has a great history, most of these dollars are in the Natural Resources Conservation Service, which Carlos has gotten a couple shout outs. I should give him a shout out, a real stalwart in the, not only obviously in California state conservationists, but was one of the real leaders at NRCS. We do great work at NRCS, but sometimes we can get a little bureaucratic. So we're spending a lot of time in DC trying to figure out how do we streamline our programs to make them work better. How do we make it easier for producers to get in? How do we make it easier for our staff to enroll folks? So you've seen a lot of work for us over the last 2 years in making those programs work better. You're going to see a continued work to make those programs work better. Even if we do all the streamlining we can and hire new staff, we're still going to rely on partners out in the field to allow us to implement these programs. So significant emphasis on partnerships. Partnerships with states, partnerships with universities, partnerships with commodity groups, conservation groups, others, to help us deploy these resources in a way that address the climate challenge, even while we make sure that it works for farmers and ranchers. One of the key questions in rolling out these resources, what do we pay for? And if you know NRCS, you know essentially we pay for practices. How do we make sure that the list of practices is the right set of practices for agriculture and forestry? And how do we change those practices in a way that allows for innovation, new technology? And that's critically important. And we need your all's help. We need the help of universities to make sure we have the best science. We need the help of folks out in the field that can help us adapt our programs to make sure that they work and that they allow for innovation. Good example of this is we have a program called the Regional Conservation Partnership Program that got a significant amount of resources in the Inflation Reduction Act. Last fall, I should say, we approved $88 million for projects that utilize feed additives. Now, you know we don't have a commercial feed additive on the market right now. More on that later. We hope it's coming soon. But the point is we wanted to be ready when those practices hit the ground. And so we've approved $88 million, assuming FDA allows for that product to move forward. NRCS will be ready to implement those practices on a way that put that feed additive to use immediately. That's one example, but there are other examples. How do we make sure that the resources we have can adapt to new innovation and technology? We have a program called Conservation Innovation Grants to allow us to think about that. But my call to all of you is to work with us, to help us innovate our programs in a way that work for all of you all and that work for the climate as well. Karen mentioned one of our real flagship efforts around climate smart agriculture and forestry, which is our partnerships for climate smart commodities. So this is a program, it's not a conservation program, it's not a set-aside program, it is a commodity program. And the purpose is to pay for commodities, to create incentives for commodities that are produced using climate smart agriculture and forestry. We set aside about $3.1 billion from the Commodity Credit Corporation, and we've invested in about 135 projects across the country: cropland, livestock, rangeland, forest land, all across the country, all 50 states. So far, I think almost 3,000 producers enrolled. We're up over 2 million acres. We expect to significantly increase that over the coming year. The program basically does four things. One, it provides incentives to dramatically scale up climate smart agriculture and forestry. We want to pay producers. We want to create incentives that de-risk the adoption of these practices. Two, we want to make sure everybody can play. So make sure that the door is open to small producers, medium-sized, large, historically underserved. Equity matters. Let's serve everybody. Three, we want to invest in measurement, monitoring, reporting, and verification. We want to make sure that we can prove that we can learn from these projects, we can prove what works, what doesn't, and the numbers are really, really important. So all these projects have a really critical MMRV component. Lastly, and importantly, we want to create value in the marketplace. So the idea here is to create a commodity which has value, whether you split the carbon off and sell it independently, or whether the carbon stays and we create opportunities for climate smart commodities in the marketplace through supply chains, through value-added products or otherwise. Secretary was in Wisconsin a couple weeks ago to announce talk about one of the projects we have with a rice company. That rice company is now producing a climate smart rice, which you can buy in the store. And the secretary was given a 2-pound bag of climate smart rice. That bag of climate smart rice is going to be the best traveled bag of climate smart rice. It's back in Washington. It's already been out in the countryside, 3 or 4 different places. It's going all over the countryside. The case that the secretary is trying to make is that we think there's value in the marketplace here. There will always be a role for government to help on the financial and technical side, but we hope to create value in the marketplace that can reward producers. And that bag of 2-pound climate smart rice is going to pick up a lot of frequent flyer miles trying to prove that point for the secretary. I mentioned in partnerships and in some of our other works, measurement, monitoring, reporting, and verification is critically important. We have a $300 million investment in MMRV. A lot of that is to improve just a simple science. We're going to put 5,000 soil carbon plots across the country to allow us to have better data related to practices, different soil types, and carbon sequestration. We're doing a lot of work around nitrous oxide and methane, and we're trying to build capacity within USDA that allow us to look at how all our programs, our policies, and otherwise influence both carbon sequestration and greenhouse gas emissions. And importantly, we want to partner with universities and otherwise to make sure we get the math right. Critically important, given the skeptics out in the countryside, that we prove this up. And if we've got the math to prove it up, we need to show our work. And so significant investments here around those things. Obviously, methane isn't just something we're thinking about domestically. There's a lot of work internationally on it as well. The administration's been involved in the global methane pledge to try and dramatically reduce methane emissions by 2030. And agriculture has a critically important role to play for that. At USDA, we're supporting the Global Methane Accelerator to look at, or the Enteric Methane Accelerator to look at ways that we can invest through our research programs and otherwise to advance innovation addressing methane. So not something that we're just thinking about at USDA, State Department, others in USDA are in the federal government doing a lot of work around methane and enteric methane in particular. One of the things that's important as well, as all you all know, is how do we improve the process for approving whether it be feed additives or other products that can help us reduce methane emissions in livestock. USDA working closely with FDA on this. But as I noted to some folks earlier today, we've got a lot of policies in the federal government that weren't built for what we're asking them to do. Things like feed additives or vaccines or other products that can help us address enteric methane. So we need to engage FDA. We need to think about how do we create streamlined processes here that can ensure not only we can deliver these types of products in a safe and expeditious way, but that we can also create incentives for the private sector to invest in these types of technologies. So continued work. I think it's an area that you'll see continued interest on Capitol Hill about. It's a place where I think we very much want to work with all of you all to make sure that we can speed the process in a way that obviously works for the public, that works for our producers and the investors on this side as well. And sort of want to conclude by saying that, to me, that is a fundamental challenge that we face in everything we do, is climate change is obviously critically important. We have to act fast. But a lot of the tools we've had for a long, long time weren't built for some of the challenges we're putting in front of them. And so as a government agency, we need to do everything we can to bend those things in ways that will actually work for greenhouse gas emissions, but that importantly will work for farmers and ranchers. So we need to we need to be faster. We need to allow for more innovation, and we need to do it in a way, again, that invites private investment. In the coming weeks from USDA, you'll see some requests for information from us on a variety of topics around USDA's role in the marketplace. What else can we do to provide more certainty for investors and others to invest in climate-smart agriculture and forestry? We have a law that was passed in late 2022 called the Growing Climate Solutions Act. It asks us to look at greenhouse gas protocols. Another act called the Sustains Act, which asks us to combine our resources with resources from the private sector to scale up climate-smart agriculture and other investments in ecosystem service markets. And as we roll these things out, we want to do it in partnership with folks in agriculture. We want to make sure that we're using our new authorities in ways that will benefit agriculture even while we address climate change. Likewise, on sustainable aviation fuel, lots of interest in how we create systems to trace the greenhouse gas benefits of certain commodities through the supply chain. We'll be engaging in the public in that as well. In all these things, we are trying to build a consensus around climate-smart agriculture and forestry, a consensus that a voluntary incentive-based approach will work, that incentives in the marketplace that reward farmers and ranchers can do well by the climate and can do well by those rural communities and those producers as well. We want to play the long game as well. You all know as well as I do that the political pendulum swings in Washington, D.C. But if we can create things that have buy-in from agriculture and forestry, if we can create things that have the science and data that we can prove can benefit the climate, that we can prove that can maintain productivity and enhance productivity in farmers and ranchers, and that can improve their bottom line, over the long term, we can build something that will have bipartisan support. And even as the pendulum swings, we can demonstrate that U.S. agriculture has a critical role to play in addressing climate change. Thank you.